Welcome back to Sociology 226. This is Erving Goffman video 2. In this video I've got three goals. First, I want to explore two of Goffman's famous books, Asylums and Stigma. Next, I want to look to Goffman's critique of strictly psychiatric understandings of mental illness and responses to that critique. Finally, I want to get you ready to do your two-paragraph response. Let's get started. After Stigma, Asylums is Goffman's most famous work. It is also the first book by a sociologist I'd ever read. Here, Goffman continues his ethnographic work. In this case, and with permission of the upper management, Goffman posed as the assistant to the athletic director of a large mental hospital. I'm quite sure you're not allowed to do that anymore. All of Goffman's work takes a mundane ethnography as its object, moments of co-presence or anticipated co-presence, drawing from these methods. Here, an ethnography of mental illness as the sporting director's assistant. A fundamental concept running throughout Asylums is that of the total institution. The scene of Asylums is most often that of the mental hospital in which Goffman did his ethnographic observation, but he treats it as a total institution, which has characteristics that are shared by many settings. Most importantly, they tend to be isolated from wider society. There is a boundary between what goes on inside and what goes on outside, with different mechanisms for information transfer between them. Be it a hospital, a residential school, jail, or a concentration camp, there are explicit walls that keep people and information in and people and information out. They can be bypassed, depending on the type of institution, but they exist nonetheless. In almost every case, there will be a permanent population of people who reside in the institution, the inmates, and there are those who operate it. There are residents and there are staff. Not only can one population leave and the other remain, but there will be a significant social distance between these two ranks. This social division and the associated fronts that come up with them are the basis of the interaction that Goffman maps throughout the book. Goffman's approach is once again dramaturgical in that he's focusing on the interaction of people in relation to others against the stage of total institutions. One of the essays in Asylums is entitled The Moral Career of the Mental Patient, one of the best in the collection. Here we can think of moral in exactly the same sense that Durkheim uses it, in terms of the interpersonal attachments that come up as people start to live in the institution. This isn't a morality of you should or you must, but the ties that we establish between one another. Recall at this time, most people were committed to the institution, and so Goffman traces how individuals come to be outfitted for life in the institution and committed to the fronts and social roles that operate in the asylum. There is a specific transition away from family life, or life in the community, to life in the asylum. This is the moral career of the mental patient. But because information from the outside world is for the most part cut off, people carve out new forms of identity and have new forms of identity thrust on them by the interpersonal interaction of the institution. Goffman tells us that many of the interactions that people and staff have in the institution, from the point of the staff, are used as justification for why the patient is so admitted. Part of maintaining the social distance between staff and patients is justifying why people are in the institution in the first place. And this is a constantly unfolding story. The following essay in the collection is The Underlife of a Public Institution. In this essay, Goffman is interested in the little ways that individuals who are committed to the institution are able to define themselves against the rules that are imposed on them. It would seem, at first sight, that a strict divide between patients and staff would mean that each of the two camps would be relatively equal. But Goffman explores how little hierarchies would develop amongst the residents of the mental hospital. He documents, for instance, how inmates with work assignments would use those positions to gain relative authority over others in the institutions, how they would use these privileges to demonstrate their status or authority. This would mean access to spaces restricted to others without a work assignment, say, or parts of the common grounds, like the yard, that would only be made available to those with the prestige accorded to them. At the time, 1956, everyone smoked, even the inmates. A small barter currency existed with cigarettes in the institution. One would be able to express their relative prestige or authority over others in small ways, like the possession of a secret stash of accumulated goods, something that would show the importance of an inmate over others. The ability to have and transport goods that were otherwise not allowed to be possessed in public was a sign of what differentiated a particular resident over another. Goffman's writing style might be winding, but you always end up with a profound statement. This is the profound statement for the Underlife essay. When existence is cut to the bone, we can learn what people do to flesh out their lives. Stashes, means of transportation, free places, territories, supplies for economic and social exchange. These, apparently, are minimal requirements for building up a life. Well, what does that mean? Goffman is making a general inference about the organization of societies. He says even when we take away all the things that make us who we are, a job, an apartment, an outside identity, when existence is cut to the bone, people will find tiny ways to mark themselves as individuals against the stage on which they are performing. Before we finish with Asylums, I want to say that I think it is one of the best sociology books ever written. It reads sort of like a time capsule. What the anxieties were in the 1950s, but it is very pertinent today. I think it is one of those books that everyone should have to read if you want to graduate from a sociology program. Stigma is likely the most famous component of Goffman's legacy. We use the term all the time, the stigma of mental illness. Well, if you're going to write a paper on the stigma of anything, you usually start with Goffman. But I want to situate it against the general project that Goffman is trying to do. I want to position this against the lay understanding of stigma. Goffman isn't just trying to identify the discrediting mark that an individual has placed on them. I think this is what most people mean when they say something is stigmatized. It has a negative social connotation that it shouldn't, and if that thing wasn't stigmatized, the world would be better. Yes, I think Goffman would agree that mental illness shouldn't be stigmatized, and that we shouldn't have weight stigma, or whatever. But what he is interested in is how people navigate their lives around that mark of difference. So, to return to our example, Goffman isn't simply saying mental illness has a bunch of social baggage. He's interested in how people carry that baggage around with them, and the way that interpersonal interaction is altered because of this. So, for example, when someone comes out as gay, polyamorous, with a learning disability, as whatever, there is a particular tactic they'll use to do so. That they were in hiding because X, Y, or Z was bad isn't the point, at least to Goffman, but it is how we navigate our lives with that understanding. This difference is really important. It isn't the mark that is especially interesting, but how we live with it. This is what Goffman means by impression management. Here's a terrible example that might make you get it. You know the Domino's Pizza on Princess and University? Yes, you do. It's in Little Pizza Town. You know, the Papa John's, the Little Caesars, the Domino's. Okay, it's across from the beer store. There, we all know what I'm talking about. So you know that there are guys out there with a sign that says 50% off Mondays or whatever. Well, some people just sit there and hold the sign, and some people hold the sign. You know what I mean. Twirling around, all that jazz. The point is not the content of the mark, 50% off pizza, but the performance around that mark. A key insight of stigma is that it isn't just difference that is performed, but also normalcy is an ongoing achievement. In the book, Goffman is making clear that we won't learn much about stigma from a sociological perspective if we simply document all the things that are stigmatized. This is simply accounting for blemishes, and not for the way that normalcy is produced and maintained in our societies. Part of this story is about passing, ways that we attempt to produce ourselves as normal, despite the perceived mark on our identities. Most of you know this story about passing. You've had a few drinks, and the beer store is going to close in 15 minutes, and you just didn't buy enough Coors Original, or whatever you students drink these days, and you need to present yourself as sober enough to buy more. Or 19 enough to buy more, or whatever. In any case, get it, case, we need to pass ourselves off as normal in whatever institutional setting, and give off the little gestures, etc., that make up normal behavior. Goffman is saying that these moments are the little rituals that make up what normal is, and the sociology of stigma is the documentation of the ways that all of us accomplish this in our daily lives. The most fortunate of normals is likely to have his half-hidden failing, and for every little failing there is a social occasion where it will loom large, creating a gap between virtual and actual social identity. It is implied, then, that it is not to the different that we should look for understanding our differentness, but to the ordinary. Page 127. I think you get the point, that everyone has something that at some point will deviate from normalcy and need to be brought in line. What matters is less the little things that cross the line, but the line itself. Now that we've looked at those two big books, let's turn to Goffman on mental illness. While I gave a description about the mental hospital as a total institution, I didn't really give you a description of mental illness therein. In asylums, Goffman is rather agnostic about the nature of mental illness. Regardless of the reasons why people came to the institution, they are there. Regardless of whether mental illness is real, it shapes the way that we present ourselves and receive others. Much of the work of the institution comes in keeping people in their place once they are there. There are ritual performances that keep people going, as staff, as a patient, whatever. But Goffman holds his cards pretty close to his chest. In asylums, Goffman is reserved about whether or not mental illness is real, rather interested in how it shapes collective life. In the essay you read for this week, Goffman is much more explicit about the role of the sociology of mental illness. He says, in the quote you can see here, that before we can identify something as a symptom of mental illness, we find that it shapes collective life first. One is only hyperactive, in this view, when they disrupt the classroom environment. Then one is coded as a hyperactive child, then assessed, and so on. If we want to get the whole story about what hyperactivity is, we need to look at the way that it is shaped in the initial classroom moment. Goffman calls this moment an example of situational impropriety. Situation, in reference to the place of co-presence where someone acts out. Impropriety in reference to the fact that there is a particular code of conduct, a particular front, that we breach. Here one expresses hyperactivity by disrupting the classroom order, just as one expresses drunkenness by slurring their words or toppling over. There is an infraction, an affront to the ritual behavior expected of somebody in a particular position. Goffman's position is that when we start the moral career of the hyperactive child, we have to locate that symptom in an initial moment. And then, part of that career is retroactively assembled as warning signs that people should have noticed, at least according to the record. To quote the piece, "The other side of the study of symptoms is the study of public order, the study of behavior in public and semi-public places. If you would like to learn about one side of this matter, you ought perhaps study the other too." Pages 139 to 140. Goffman's side of critique moves to psychiatric discourse itself. In asylums, Goffman is pretty reserved about his disdain for institutional psychiatry. In the piece you read, he's pretty open about it. I'll quote it to you. "Few professions have so well been able to institutionalize, to sell on the open market, their own fantasies of what they were engaged in doing." Page 139. This is pretty darn explicit. Psychiatrists see themselves as healers. Really, at least according to Goffman, they are either accidentally or intentionally policing socially acceptable behavior with medical terminology. We know this, at least he argues, in the fact that outside of the particular situation, many of these improprieties wouldn't have been infractions at all. Here he uses a rather sexist and classist scene of street harassment, an upper middle class girl avoiding the hoots of slum-dwelling youths. In some cases, to fail to communicate is seen as impropriety. Our subject here, however, is simply playing the hand she was dealt. I think a less sexist or classist example would be in reference to so-called crazy ex-girlfriends, in air quotes. I'm sure you've all been talking to some dude who says, "Oh man, my ex was so crazy." And then, like the critical sociology student that you are, you start to wonder if she acted that way because she was, in fact, treated poorly by the guy telling you the story. By exploring the situation in which the impropriety occurred, we find out that this was really a story about interpersonal interaction gone wrong, and not a story about mental illness. In this instance, Cody gaslighting his ex-girlfriend. We can come up with two degrees of argument here. The strong claim, then, is that institutional psychiatry is involved in simply maintaining a partial story of social order and not healing sickness. The weaker claim, however, is that there are always improprieties associated with a particular form of mental illness and that sociologists should look at them. I leave it up to you to come up with a position on this matter. To summarize, what matters for us is this. In line with the claims of asylums and the presentation of self, Goffman is arguing that mental illness is to be located in routine interaction and that there is a career with definitive stages that goes along with the treatment of mental illness. In line with Stigma, he's suggesting that there isn't a clear line between normal and abnormal, and that there are performances that are very similar on both sides of the divide. Let's contrast Goffman's work, briefly, with Talcott Parsons' sick role. First and foremost, we can distinguish these two sociologies through the fact that Parsons' role doesn't move much. It is a place in the social structure that someone occupies or doesn't. You're either sick or you're not. You're either obligated this way or the other way. Things for Goffman are different. We locate his understanding of mental illness in the forms of co-presence and the types of behavior located therein. His is also situated in the hospital, in the classroom. While Parsons talks about the sick role, he doesn't talk about the stage where it takes place. Following Parsons' focus on functional roles, we find that the sick role emerges because it needs to. We can't keep a social action system going unless we have a way to deal with those who don't play their part. The sick role is one response to social strain. It is a normal response to abnormal systemic action. For Goffman, mental illness is a performance recognized as abnormal, the other side of the same coin. There are stigmatized identities that we all possess in one form or the other. We put the normal to work as we hide them, as we try to pass as normal. There isn't really a larger picture to overall social action, as in structural functionalism, just tiny snippets of interactive life. Finally, I think Parsons' sick role is far more focused on the management of those that deal with the sick role. It is something to be studied scientifically by the relevant scientists. As we see in asylums, Goffman, however, is far more interested in how we live with and around mental health, rather than how we restore it. Erving Goffman's work is not without its critiques, both internally from sociologists and externally from mental health professionals. As one of the most famous sociologists, Goffman is not without detractors. Here I thought I would focus on two different forms. The first relates to the claims that he's making about mental illness. Goffman usually gets lumped in with a bunch of people referred to as anti-psychiatrists, others making the strong claim that I mentioned earlier. The reply from those whose business it is to treat mental illness is pretty clear. You are arguing that mental illness isn't real, but it is. Yes, you're right. We must situate all mental symptoms in their proper context, but just because they are socially situated doesn't mean that they are pretend. What would a non-situated psychiatry or psychology even look like? If anything, to pursue the kind of critiques that Goffman is making might contribute to the problems faced by those with mental illness because it makes the blemish of getting help even worse than it currently is, forcing people to pass when they might go to the doctor. Again, this belongs to the strong claim of the argument, rather than the soft one. But these are the kinds of critiques being launched at Goffman by mental health professionals. Secondly, the materialist response. Lots of people have criticized Goffman's work from a Marxist perspective, including in disability studies. Even if Goffman turns his attention away from the individual form of stigma itself, of mental health or whatever, in light of the ways that we live with and around stigmatized identities, Goffman doesn't really come close to describing how they are caused. Like Weber, Goffman doesn't really do cause at all. We can give a description of a situation and give a sociological viewpoint of it, but he doesn't provide us much for solving the problem or even identifying the problematic aspects. Marxists will say, look, it doesn't really matter how we feel about or interpret the various forms of exclusion that you talk about in stigma. The point, however, is to change them. Now, that said, these are exactly the same sort of critiques that Marxists will say about anything that isn't about capitalism, so take that with a grain of salt. The final question is of social structure. I know all of you probably like the idea that we're all performing all the time. Just walking down the street, you're doing it, or ordering a beer. But one of the most important questions to pose to Goffman is, how is it that we take a common type of performance? Are we totally free to perform however we want, or does something dictate how and why we do that? The problem here is that Goffman doesn't offer more than a description of action and cannot account for its regularity. He doesn't really deal with the agency structure problem. Sorry, that went over 15 minutes. I guess you're getting your money's worth. Now it's your turn. In 2 paragraphs between 5 to 8 sentences in length and with reference to the readings, explain what it means to call Goffman a micro-sociologist, and explain, in the second paragraph, how we can study mental illness through this approach.